Hello, Titans. I am your host, Cari. I will be your guide on a conversation on modernism and mental illness. Mental health has become an important and common topic in the United States, especially with the rise of social media conversations on various mental illnesses and neural disorders and diagnoses. Mental health has joined the forefront of what encompasses a healthy person. Now, information on the psychological isn't distant, but at the fingertips of many people. Currently, the current manual and standard classification of mental illnesses and disorders is the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The fifth edition was created in 2013 and has a lot of attention to culture, racism, and discrimination that can affect people struggling with mental illness and other mental disorders. But even before the social media age, many people struggled with mental illnesses and have talked about it. One of the groups that has paved the way in representing mental illnesses is the authors and artists of the Modernist Movement. But I'll allow my expert on modernism to take a deep dive into that topic. Today I'm also with Dr. Stefan Pasqualina, an English professor at the University of Detroit Mercy who specializes in modernist literature and visual culture and transnational American studies. He also focuses on Black studies and critical theory. He is currently working on two book projects. One is on the 20th century visualizations of U.S. empire, and the other on political thought and social thought of the Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston. Pasqualina's scholarship has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including Modernism/Modernity, which is Malus J19, the Journal of 19th Century Americanists, the Journal of American Culture, and Mark Twain Annual. His writings also appeared in public books and higher education and marktwainstudies.org. Prior to arriving at the University of Detroit Mercy in 2022, he has a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he taught courses in American Studies, Science and Technology, and Society in the Modern Era, twice receiving the Excellence of Honors Award for teaching and mentorship in the Honors College. He completed his PhD at the University of Southern California, where he taught in the Thematic Option Honors Program. His research has been supported by the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Center for Mark Twain Studies, and Future of American Studies Institute at Dartmouth College, and the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University. So, folks, let's dive into 20th century and let's get a glimpse of what's going on in the modernist head. But right before that, I want to give a trigger warning. Since we'll be discussing topics of mental illness, we will also be talking about suicide, and we will be talking about the perception of these mental illnesses. There will be a lot of topics on suicide and many other depressing topics, so I'm just giving a trigger warning. Thank you. Let's dive into it. All right. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so happy to dive into this topic. I have like a sliver of knowledge on modernism.
You have more than a sliver.
Thanks to your friends. But nobody is as knowledgeable on the modernist writers at our university outside of yourself. So, representing all modernist scholars here.
That's a lot of pressure.
What is modernism?
What is modernism? So this is a notoriously difficult question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of debate in the field of modern studies about what the word means. The way I would start to answer the question is what it was taken to mean when it first started circulating in the mid-20th century. It generally referred to late 19th to mid-20th century literature that shared a set of traits. One of the key terms that gets thrown around with modernist literature is experimentation. So experimental literature that was often written against the tradition of 19th century realism. Traditionally, it was conceived of as European and American, almost exclusively white, sprinkled in with maybe some inclusion of some African American writers. Increasingly, though, in the past 25 to 30 years, there's been more of a move to think about modernism as a global phenomenon that's not just in Europe and the US. Modernism is thought to take place in Latin America and Asia and other parts of the globe at different moments. But generally, I would say if people are using the term modernism, what they're referring to is still late 19th to mid 20th century literature that is in some way challenging normative assumptions about psychology, representation, history. Modernist literature is often thought to be kind of countercultural. There's been critiques in the past 30 years, especially that it also has a lot of conservatism behind it. Figures like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, these were on a spectrum of conservative or royalist to fascist. Modernism invited a lot of extreme voices. It's a period in which things feel up for grabs globally about the fate of capitalism, the fate of democracy in many parts of the globe. So it's a period of transition for sure, a period of literary and other forms of experimentation. I would say today it's increasingly thought of as a global phenomenon that has to do with this shift historically from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, centered on the world wars, industrialization, a lot of social movements globally. It's a period of change, and a lot of the writers that are considered modernist are responding to a pretty rapidly changing world.
It's responding to the changes that's going on in the world. So this internal, like, so almost like writers itself were starting to see what was going on in their world, and they responded to it on paper. I want to go back to that thing. When you're talking about, for modernism, you're talking about conservatism, and like how that starts to get imbued in terms of the writing, the mentalities of many writers. Would you be able to just talk a little bit more about it? Explain it.
So there's many brands of conservatism within modernism. So T.S. Eliot identified himself as a royalist in politics, a classicist in literature, and a Christian in religion, or an Anglican in religion, or I forget how he phrased it. Yeah, he was Anglican. Eliot is often writing through what he saw as the inherent anarchy of a world torn by two world wars, especially World War I. And his response in the wake of World War I is to turn to myth. He's very interested in Greek myth and religion as kind of stabilizing forces that help organize a world that feels chaotic and fragmentary. Ezra Pound, a good friend of his, took this much further. He was an avowed fascist. He did broadcasts on the radio in Rome that were pro-Mussolini. He thought that U.S. democracy was part of this chaotic, inchoate world that he was witnessing in the wake of World War I and World War II. Also deeply anti-Semitic, for a period sympathetic to Hitler. I think those two figures are sometimes imagined as anti-modernist in that they're not sympathetic to socialism, they're not revolutionary. I would say they're revolutionary in a different way. They're trying to impose order on a world that feels chaotic, especially in a moment when, I'll say this especially for Eliot, fascism and conservatism feels like possibly a cure to society's ills. If we think about fascism before the Holocaust, it's a different thing than it is after the Holocaust. There are a lot of smart people that were interested in fascism. W.B. Yeats, the Irish writer, is also one of these people. The ones who stuck around once Hitler's atrocities became public knowledge are the ones that I think are especially deeply problematic, Pound being one of them. What I would say about, like, how do you make sense of the conservatism that's in modernism? It's a time in which the order of the world, the way the world economies and societies should be organized, are called into question. And one of the potential solutions is fascism.
Mm, that's interesting. I think, especially when you're talking about how conservatism was considered an option to cure the ills of the world, that seems to be a very important theme going on in a lot of modernist writing, is how to cure what's going on in the world, how to cure something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I know you're going with this with mental health.
Yeah, well, I mean, I find it interesting because, especially when we're talking about how these conservative writers have these mentalities who are a lot more conservative, it kind of juxtaposed many of the other writers of the time who are also in the modernist movements, who have this understanding of curing the social ills and what's going on, is to talk about what's going on mentally, physically, and to find those as an assessment to analyze what we need to be doing politically and what we need to expand further. I don't want to talk too much about what we're going to go into yet, but I'd say for that element, for instance, if we're talking about Virginia Woolf versus a T.S. Eliot kind of response on how things are going, Virginia Woolf is in just very conflicting, almost conflicting in that conservative ideals, especially when we're talking about her more open stances on some things, or what characters are talking about in her books, or what she's writing in her poems can sometimes be against that conservative mentality that many of the original people of the Modernist movement, like Pound, would be saying.
Yeah, Woolf, I would say, is a quasi-aristocratic liberal. She's moneyed, admits in one of her books that she has a trust fund, and that's how she kind of gets by. But she has, I would say, kind of like polite liberal politics. She believes in, she writes a very famous feminist tract called A Room of One's Own, where she's imagining a society in which women are kind of given the same infrastructure or material support to write that men have historically been given. She writes especially about Shakespeare's sister and what Shakespeare's sister could have produced had she had a room of her own to write in and not had the kind of the motherly and or wifely duties of how women have been kind of, or the duties that women are often imagined to have socially. But Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, I know you're reading, and the character of Septimus Smith is like one of the key figures of a so-called unwell figure in modernist literature. And I think he is an interesting case study for thinking about this question of wellness. I don't want to lead down that road too much if you have a question to butt in there, but yeah, Woolf is... The other thing, just as an aside, Eliot and wellness is something that I have not thought about too much, but Eliot was often unwell, personally. Didn't write about health very much, except in his letters. But it's curious to think about how the body is enmeshed in the social circumstances of a society. This is true of Woolf as well, who writes about living through the Blitzkrieg. She wrote in the 1940s that it was almost impossible to write a long novel anymore because you are so interrupted in London by the bombardment of military warfare from Germany that you're not sure if you have tomorrow,
Yeah, I think the element of modernism, I think the biggest aspect is to understand that it's like the internalization of one's external reality. So like the mind versus the body kind of mentality.
That's good.
So when you're internalizing what's going on with you, whether that be like illness, whether that be the ills of what's going on in the society, that element also gets that's how it gets fought with in the mind. I guess for me, when I think about when I've looked at Eliot's writing, sometimes I feel like there's this conflict of the internalization of what's going externally, what's going on in his life, illness, there's forms of weakness in some sense. I think Pound kind of plays with that idea too. What is weak is what is natural, what is human sometimes. And so when you are having illness, I guess in that conservative mindset, that would be like, that's a form of weakness, and why would you want to?
It is really, so there is this kind of critical turn in modernist studies over the past 5 years toward what's called weak theory, which is coined by Eve Sedgwick, who's a kind of seminal queer theorist. So there's been a coinage, weak modernism, and the idea of weakness in this register is modernism has historically been cloaked in really strong rhetoric about revolution, aesthetic experimentation, overturning norms. This journal that Wyndham Lewis and Pound put together was called Blast. That's kind of representative of the avant-garde, incendiary spirit of modernism. Mm-hmm. Weak modernism, as a critical coinage, is interested in identifying curiosity in modernist texts, openness, articulating a critical orientation toward literature and culture that's not about advancing really strong theories or political programs as much as it is about opening up avenues for questions. The other angle of weak modernism that's really been important for thinking globally is that a lot of scholars who embrace this term weak modernism have taken up this idea of weak ties, which some social scientists talk about, like your connections to acquaintances or maybe classmates that you don't talk with regularly, but you have some affiliation with them. If we stick with like the strong approach to modernism, you might focus on figures like Eliot and Pound and their immediate network. Weak modernists, including Dan Morse, who's a friend of mine, who wrote a book recently called Radio Empire, so-called weak modernist critics have embraced thinking about kind of loose connections among figures globally, where you can find patterns of responses to global crises, but it's not like, okay, Eliot is close friends with Pound, so we can think about them together. It's more like, let's think about British writers' relationship to Indian writers who are dealing with a colonial relationship in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but maybe they don't know each other, or maybe they share a space in some publication, or they share a space on the radio, the BBC radio. That's enough of a tie. So that idea of like weak ties among figures has been important for critics to think about global relationships.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest aspects also is the pandemic that happens during that era as well.
The Spanish flu?
Yeah, the Spanish flu. Obviously, we recently went through a pandemic, and I think in some aspect, those internal viral elements of being ill or seeing people ill, being in that quarantined mentality, which they did have a quarantine during the Spanish flu, for people who don't know.
COVID lockdowns were not the first.
Yeah, it's not the first.
Yeah.
I think there's this understanding that I think when you have an illness or you have other people ill, or when there's illness happening and that fear, it gets internalized in terms of people's mental health and people's understandings of self and what they think of mentally. I wanted to bring up one of the pieces that I think is really important from viral modernisms, the Influenza pandemic and the interwar period by Elizabeth Outka. And it talks a lot about the development of everything that's going on. And they have this modernizing of medicine and psychotherapy. They have all these understandings of everything is getting revolutionized. Everything is getting updated. And because of that, clear linear language and narratives, which is something that gets pushed in some elements during the modernist era, also gets fragmented. And I want to talk about one particular line that she says is fragmented. Symptoms appear without a clear context. The atmosphere of vulnerability is unmoored from particular causes. The pandemic itself remains largely unnamed. It captures a time before it had developed into a discrete event with more and understandable contours. The pandemic literary paradigm, I guess. When we like think about how physical elements like that can affect mental health or can affect the person, I think all these things kind of tie together in my mindset. I don't think in itself, I guess when I was reading, my experience of reading modernist writers, especially in your class and things like that, I felt like war, I felt like suffering and all these pains and ills that really start to get uprooted and brought into people's attention in the shift into the 20th century.
And that they're pervasive. It's not there's a war happening in Europe.
Yeah.
It's kind of grounded in the body, even of one who's not on the front lines.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, there's suffering all is happening to everyone. And I think also in some sense the having an epidemic and having a pandemic, moreover, in a specific area, it can affect the mentality. And I think there's this understanding of wanting to highlight life, strength, wealth, and those kind of understandings really get pushed through because of that. And these are things that are deemed as important, those skills of strength and things like that. You have all these advancements in technology, especially with how rapidly it was happening on the front lines. You have it's like, you know, a lot of time when we talk about World War I, there's a lot of sickness that happens. A lot of disabled people come out of that. So I think it affects a lot of people mentally and what's going on with them. Again, as I already said, the pandemic that kills many people, a lot of war killing many people, sounds familiar. It feels a lot like what's going on now.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. A film comes to mind, Charlie Chaplin's 1936 film Modern Times, which is largely about, it's a comedy, but it makes a serious argument. That's about the effect of industrialization on, I would say, the human psyche and the body. The tramp, which is Charlie Chaplin's character, he's working on the assembly line early in the film, and he can't stop doing the repetitive motions of the assembly line even when he's not working. It's as if the machine has kind of like baked itself into his body. I think that's true of industrialization and war, that there is a psychosomatic reverberation that comes from both direct experiences with industrialization and war, but also more indirectly. And this is true, I mean, living through the pandemic, I think this is true. You did not need to have COVID to be affected by the pandemic. In a similar way, you did not need to be fighting on the front lines in World War I to be affected by the war. I would say in the Spanish flu case, too, you do not need to have the Spanish flu to be affected by the pandemic of the Spanish flu. So I think that this is really useful, like the idea of the pandemic as a social phenomenon that's both physical, rooted in the body, but also social and psychological, right? They're all interrelated.
Exactly. Let's continue on this idea of mental health and things. And what does madness and mental health have to do with modernism and its aesthetics?
Yeah. So I would say there's two ways in which modernism deals with mental health that I can think of. One is there are a number of characters and figures in modernist literature who are framed as mentally ill. So Septimus Smith is a famous example in Mrs. Dalloway. He's suffering what was then called shell shock. We'd call it PTSD today. Another example is the character of Benji in The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. Faulkner writes in the language of this character who's 33 years old, who has a mental disability. It's not quite clear what the diagnosis of this character is, but you hear it in the voice of this character from the first chapter. Another example that comes to mind is one that we just covered in class, Zora Neale Hurston's chapter on zombies in her ethnography of Jamaica and Haiti, titled Tell My Horse, which is focused in part on a woman, Felicia Felix Mentor, who you could say is mentally unwell. The reasons for that are kind of ambiguous. So that's one thing. But so the second thing to consider is like, why is modernism and modernist writers, why are they interested in figures that embody unwellness at the level of psychology or the mental? And that, I would say, is addressed in part by this theoretical disagreement about modernism between two figures from the first half of the 20th century. Georg Lukács, who's a Hungarian philosopher and literary critic, and Bertolt Brecht, who's a German poet and playwright. So Lukács thought of modernist experimentation, especially expressionism. Faulkner, he writes about explicitly. James Joyce, he really despises. He thinks of this aesthetic experimentation that comes out of this period as akin to mental illness. He calls it a kind of psychosis. His critique of it is that modernist writing, often you'll hear from students, it's difficult. It requires a lot of attention. It doesn't sound like the kind of literature we're used to reading for much of like elementary school and high school, which I would say operates largely within a realist paradigm. Modernist writing, Lukács argues, is a break from realism and therefore a break from social critique. It's all in one's head. He thinks of it as like navel gazing. It's not invested in engaging with society's ills. Lukács is a Marxist, and Lukács believes that one of literature's prime duties is to address the problems in a society, face those, represent them, imagine alternatives. He thinks modernism does not give us tools for that. It gives us tools for looking inside of our own heads. Bertolt Brecht, who himself was a modernist writer, says in response to Lukács, that's absolutely not true. Modernism is realistic at the level of form. It is engaging in a society that is fragmented, that's undergoing revolutions in social relations, material relations, and it's representing that at the level of the formal composition of texts. So if the 19th century British Victorian novel is famous for kind of realizing the heights of aesthetic realism, Brecht says modernist writers who you think aren't making any sense, they're stuck inside their own heads, they're actually dealing in a way with the realities of the early 20th century, which are not the same as those of the 19th century. I'm sympathetic to Brecht, though I think Lukács is a brilliant critic and has important insights about modernism. There's one other thing I would say about this paradigm of modernism and mental illness, which is just the most extreme example, I guess, of the Lukács critique. He doesn't write about this writer, but Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein's an incredibly experimental writer. Her texts often produce laughter in class because they don't seem to make much sense. Yeah, Tender Buttons we read last semester. There was an American communist writer and social activist, Mike Gold, who said that Gertrude Stein, it's in a piece called Gertrude Stein, a Literary Idiot. I don't have the exact language in my head, but he accuses her of being mentally unwell. That's the only way you could make sense of this experimental writing. She must be, quote unquote, crazy. And he thinks of Stein's writing and that notion of mental illness as being associated with bourgeois thinking. I find that association really interesting. Lukács makes the association, and so does Mike Gold. They both say modernism and the experimentation of modernism is akin to mental illness, and that is bourgeois. That leap I find curious, and that's maybe you could help me think about what that means.
I don't know. I feel like it's kind of weird to say that because if modernism is like taking in my brain, a lot of it is taking that mass of what's going on, and it tries to interpret it in one's own mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if it sounds mentally ill, maybe is that highlighting the social ills that's going on in the society?
That would be the Brecht argument. Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess, like, I don't know. Because I think having this understanding of their writing sounds mentally ill in your head, and you're saying maybe you need some mental health awareness of what's going on. I'm like, isn't that a highlight of what's, and I don't know. I'm very much more akin to the understanding that mental illness and this friction between mental illness and what's going on in the social ills is there for a reason. I think especially with this time period in the 19th century, especially before, they have this constant desire to want to be moved away from weakness, especially when you have social Darwinism really starting to rear its head during this time.
Yeah, social Darwinism is an interesting angle for this too. Yeah.
How do you think of, like, I guess, how does the creation of art, literature, and especially for this movement, and when it comes to modernism, how is this friction of illness, and like, how does it's a clear friction, because a lot of these, I'll say a lot of them are getting told that they're mentally ill because of their writing. A lot of them are actually mentally ill, but I wouldn't say it's because of what kind of writing they do, but they're just simply mentally ill. But I don't think this is a time when, I don't know, psychology is really starting to get its, really big, like...
Right, Freudian psychoanalysis is
that's when psychoanalysis... Yeah, it's really starting to start. So, like, a lot of these, I think people are more comfortable calling someone mentally ill, especially because of what's going on during the time period. You have eugenics going on, you have social Darwinism, you have all these things talking about the strength of people. When you see people who are writing in a way that isn't traditional, they don't like the beauty aesthetics, they don't like these perpetual states of beautiful form or something like that. It's just,
Yeah, modernism, if it represents a turn in the history of art and literature, one of the main things I would say is that the beautiful is no longer it's not its primary interest. That we could say that that's part of the so-called romantic contract. Romantic literature, romantic painting is devoted to producing the beautiful. Modernism, I don't think is primarily interested in the beautiful. What does it replace the beautiful with? I think that's up for grabs. Often chaos, but this question about strength and weakness, or illness and wellness, it's pervasive in a lot of literature of this period. We were just reading Zora Neale Hurston in class, and Hurston uses the metaphor of wellness to talk about, in the era of Jim Crow, her being beyond slavery. She says the patient is well, the patient is cured, I'm good, and I'm off to the races. She says later in another piece, she uses the metaphor of the body being sick to talk about the ills of Jim Crow, and she's like, the patient is not well, and the doctor can't just simply declare you well unless you actually address the social issues. But that's just to say, not to work out like what is Hurston getting at. It's to say that there is a frequent turn to the metaphor of wellness to describe social ills in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, we'll say. And I think that maybe speaks to this idea of what you're saying, Cari, about modernists grappling with society's ills at the level of the body, and the link between the psychological and the social. I think of Freud and Marx. Freud is writing in this period in the early 20th century. Marx is dead by then, but casts a large shadow over the 20th century. What Freud does, I think, for the psychological, the mental, which is to say, there is an unconscious reality. There's a reality of things that we can't see, but they are real. They have real effects on individuals. They need to be articulated into the conscious mind to be dealt with. I think that's what Marx is doing for the society. right? He's saying that there is a kind of social or political unconscious that needs to be articulated through his critique of capitalism. I think the fusion of the two, both these figures really influential in this period, the fusion of the two explains to me what's going on in modernist art and literature largely, which is thinking about the relationship between the social and the political on the one hand, and the psychological, the intimate, the interior on the other hand.
Okay.
My brain's firing at a million miles an hour right now. I have all these other thoughts about how mental illness figures in modernism because of you. Yeah.
I know. I mean, I find it. I only just noticed it because, in terms of a lot of my reading and experience, in terms of modernism, and when I look at modernist art, and I especially was looking at the After Paris exhibition after Cubism.
Yeah.
In Paris, and a lot of it deals with health. It's in this perpetual state of looking at one's own body, especially with, and I think a mechanism plays into that. Like they start removing themselves from Cubism to go back to realism, and then some of them starts pulling from pieces of literature to somehow go back into this
realism as wellness is that I've never thought about that quite that way, but
because we think of modernism as an era, but there's so many ideas and thoughts and opinions that are going around in that era. I don't know.
Yeah, modernism, I should say, the fuzziness about the term in part is, do you say it's an era? It's a period in which art and culture is produced. Is it a style? Is it a political orientation in works of art? Could you be a modernist in the 18th century? Could you be a modernist now? The traditional periodization is something like the 1880s to the 1940s. But to me, the way I would answer that question is it describes a cultural phenomenon that you can see in large patterns. It's not to say that there weren't instances of that in the 18th century. Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern is sometimes thought of as the first modernist novel. Yes, it has like a lot of the trappings of modernism, but it's exceptional. The reason that it stands out is that it's not like other things of the period. So I would not call that like the modernist period. I like thinking of modernism as a condition. It's a historical situation which writers and artists are forced to grapple with. I love this idea of cubism and futurism as being like representative of a kind of physical and psychic chaos, and the cure for it is realism, which seems to like integrate the person back into the social whole.
That just seems to be the mentality of so many of the modernists during this time. They're like suddenly like, okay, well, I've come back from war, I'm mentally kind of not feeling the best, so I'm gonna grapple with what is real, and so Cubism isn't real anymore, even though they loved. I don't know.
Well, this is an interesting question. So, like Bertolt Brecht, who I just mentioned, he I think would say, I'm not sure if he wrote about Cubism, but I think he would say that Cubism is a form of something like hyper-realism. It's actually more realistic than a traditional landscape. What you see in a landscape that seems like really representationally faithful, that takes a lot of skill, it's well executed, it kind of looks, it could look photographic. That's well and good, but I think he would say, Brecht would say, that is denying the process through which the external environment gets kind of integrated into a psyche, and the way of being a realist in the early 20th century is to do something fragmentary, experimental, to break the planes up of an image, to reflect like the psychological state of the time. That's part of the landscape of what the real is, I think Brecht would say.
The landscape of what's real. We're going to shift a little bit. We're going to finally talk about the main conversation that we're going to have today, which is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. For a little bit of introduction, I'm going to say a few things about how this ties into our conversation that we've had about modernism, and also the aesthetics of, and also how illness ties into the aesthetics of modernism. So for a little bit of background, Mrs. Dalloway is throwing a party to celebrate life and youth after World War I. We also have the understanding that she had the Spanish flu. She talks a lot about her interior versus exterior. She talks about her aging a lot. A lot of the people she talks to are middle-aged, so a lot of them talk about how she looks in terms of aging, especially with her former friends from her youth. Outside of that, we're also going to be talking about our main conversation in terms of mental health. Septimus Waring Smith, we've already started talking about him. And he is a World War I veteran with shell shock, and he has distinction. He left with distinction, and he has some very serious shell shock, which we know now is PTSD. And we start seeing this mindset of almost former illness, and this understanding of like how physical illness versus mental illness starts to play around. And Virginia Woolf likes to play with it a little bit in her writing, and it starts with this understanding of how he reacts to a situation versus how she reacted to a situation. Being foils, Mrs. Dalloway versus Septimus. We started with this situation where she's in a flower shop and she hears a bang. And she sees that it's a car. It's over. The storyline, she's like, oh my goodness, I wonder who it is. It's royalty. And then she walks home. And then she goes back onto her life and she starts thinking about what she's done through her whole life. She kind of moves on from this scenario. For Septimus, this bang starts a whole like unraveling of his whole mental state in some sense. For us, we start to peer into what's going on in his brain. I'm going to talk about two things that he does in this circumstance before we start. The DSM-5 in criteria B, when we're talking about PTSD, is emotional distress after exposure of traumatic reminders. Hint that traumatic reminder. Physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders. So there's this internal versus external state starts to play around with what's going on in that mental distress. We're going to go into this, but especially with Dr. Holmes and how he looks at Septimus, I kind of like to think of that as that conservative, that big mentality of internal versus external. Dr. Holmes is unimpressed by Mr. Smith's state. He lounges about all days with his wife, a complete nervous breakdown, and it just needs to take rest out. Is taking all this rest at home, and so Dr. Holmes is like perceived as the essence of human nature in Septimus's mind, but he's also has this posturing, which I think plays into that commentary that Virginia Woolf is having on what a lot of modernists say, like, you just need to work, you should be working. I'm fine, why aren't you fine? He's mentally going through a lot of things and he cannot seem to grasp that understanding. He's saying there's nothing wrong with you physically, therefore there should be nothing wrong with you right now. Why are you laying down? Why are you rambling and scaring your wife? Yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah. As you were describing Mrs. Dalloway, which is, I love Mrs. Dalloway as a novel. The character, I like her too, but I love the novel Mrs. Dalloway. I haven't read it in a while, but I have more recently read a short story that is very much akin to or kind of sympathetic with your reading of Septimus Smith, which is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So that's written in 1892. Most people, I think, would not call that a modernist story. I would.
I think it is.
Yeah, I think because it is challenging normative assumptions about psychology. You could say a lot of realist literature does that too, but whatever. I think there's some realism that crosses over with modernism. But that story too, that's focused largely on a physician, the narrator's husband, who says there's nothing wrong with you. because there's no physical symptoms that he can see. He thinks that she's kind of making up her unwellness, but his cure is for her to just rest, which is actually based on a famous psychologist at the time who prescribed women to just rest when they were unwell. And there's this distinction between the rest cure and the west cure. This doctor would say women should rest and men should go out west and have an adventure. That's what's best for you.
Theodore Roosevelt yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Roosevelt actually followed this prescription. I'm wondering, because I haven't read Mrs. Dalloway in a while, one thing that comes to mind for me with Septimus and his relation to the doctor is, he's a military veteran, which is often framed as a very masculine thing to do, to go fight off in a war, and his need to now be inactive relatively. I wonder if Woolf, I'd have to look back at the novel, but if Woolf conveys that this is imagined as like a feminine way of being.
She really does.
Yeah.
In the conversations of other characters, which I think this is a really important aspect of this book, he kind of like almost laps these big conversations of talking about one's life in retrospect that a lot of the sane characters will do. I think some of the other characters have some narcissistic tendencies and other things. So I don't think a single character who we delve into mentally for a long period of time is really healthy or well in some instance. But I think it's clear that one is deemed mentally ill in terms of a psychotic break in that Septimus. A lot of the characters, especially Peter Welsh, he talks about how masculinity and femininity a lot. He does this a lot of comparisons.
That's right. I remember this now. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that he talks about is like men just do things. They just like go about and do it. And then they talk about how masculine it is to be like a war veteran. And then he starts seeing, and which is the most interesting thing is while Septimus is having an episode, I guess, while he's in the park with his wife, he sees him talking. He sees her crying and sad, the wife, and he says, what could he have done to make her so emotionally distressed, basically? And it kind of leads into the understanding, like, it's almost deemed as unmasculine for him to be mentally ill.
Right.
And it's the assumption that something's wrong with her, especially in Welsh's case, because of that.
And the inverse of that is that mental illness is feminine. So that, I mean, this is like an incredibly common trope that women are crazy. Yeah. Right? Men are irrational. So for a man to be struggling with a form of mental illness is for him not to be a man, in effect.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, so the intersection of disability and gender I find really interesting. The other thing that I think that Woolf does with the character of Septimus Smith, which is not uncommon in modernist writing on mental illness, is that Septimus is insightful, right? Like it is not just that he misunderstands the world or that mental illness is a false framing of the world. It's that mental illness sometimes enables insights into a world that might be framed as having gone mad, right? So, like, I'm thinking about James Joyce's Ulysses. The last chapter is in the voice of one of the main characters' wives, Penelope. And Penelope speaks in these incredibly long sentences. This chapter is, I think, like 50 pages long and has 8 sentences total. And that chapter was in part inspired by Joyce's own daughter, the way that she communicated. Joyce's daughter was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So this is now thought of largely as a euphemism in disability discourse, but the label differently abled. I think modernist literature's engagement with mental illness often gives kind of form to the idea of being differently abled, that the so-called mentally ill may be the ones to communicate insights into society that the so-called sane can't, right? We read a story in our modernism class by Lu Xun, a Chinese writer of the 1920s, called Diary of a Madman, which is about exactly this, right? Like the narrator's so-called mad brother is the one who's able to reveal this sick society of cannibals that he's a part of in China. It's allegorical, but the point is in that story, and I think to a degree in Mrs. Dalloway and in Ulysses, that those labeled mentally ill often have insights about a world that is itself maybe has gone ill, right?
Yeah, I think especially when I was reading through it, a lot of the things I noticed was that some sentences that Septimus would say in just one, like 3 pages, would come into it would finally get brought out in the mental stream of consciousness of other characters. By the way, if you haven't read Mrs. Dalloway, there's not really paragraphs, really. There's not really, like, chapters. It's just kind of like the feeling of when you think an area is kind of
That's
done.
right. Yeah, Woolf's very formally experimental. She's like a quintessential modernist in that way.
Yeah. A lot of them, they reach conclusions that Septimus makes, but he'll just say it within like 3 sentences after another idea, like this understanding of the consciousness of people, and he starts connecting things to streams and water, and then later you'll hear Mrs. Dalloway and her mental escape. She'll start going like, yeah, things are sometimes like water, and they'll start saying things that Septimus would be saying, but like after thinking for a long period of time, it's very stretched out.
Now, do you recall? I don't recall.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. How Septimus's thoughts seep into the voice of other characters. Do they have an exchange and that comes about afterwards, or is it they're isolated?
It's like they won't even, because here's the thing, a lot of things sequences all these sequences happen in like at the same time,
right,
while others are occurring. So the only thing that you can really notice in terms of what's going on time-wise, in terms of a timeline, is on the basis of Big Ben and its clock.
Yes.
So you can go into you'll be reading something that's maybe 30 pages long, and it will only be 15 minutes in this book.
And that, I think the image of Big Ben in Mrs. Dalloway is incredibly important. That, to me, this is not a controversial reading. It's kind of a predictable reading, but Big Ben, the striking of the clock represents mechanical time, which does not correspond with the subjective and intersubjective experience of time throughout the novel. So there's this tension between this external mechanical device that's clicking off seconds and minutes and hours versus the tension that we all feel in our lives between ourselves and the clock. We have memories that bring us backward. We have hopes and anxieties that bring us forward. We're bored and time seems to go on forever, or we're having a lot of fun and time flies, right? So I think that novel plays with this tension between mechanical time and subjective time. Yeah.
And I think in some essence, this kind of starts to get played with a lot more when the cycles that Septimus goes through mentally. He goes in cycles, like when he talks and he thinks, and he starts calling his wife a friend that he used to know. He thinks of Evans. He thinks of all doctors as kind of these elements of human nature, he's in his state. He believes that the world and human nature itself thinks that he committed a sin, a crime to a point, and his sentence has to be death. And he goes into these cycles of that. And I think one of the biggest elements that starts to happen is when people have these conversations with him and he can't finish the sentence. He can't understand what's saying audibly. But mentally, when we're reading it's not 100%, it doesn't read as sane, but it makes cohesive sense internally. For instance, when we're talking about let's go back to the doctors that are working in his state. He takes a rest leave. He goes to a home for a while, for 6 months. And Dr. William Bradshaw deals with a lot of veterans. And he has this understanding. He's a very masculine figure. He deems himself as such. In this interesting third person stream of consciousness, this kind of like almost free and direct discourse, but then at one point they start talking in first person and then they go away and it goes back into third. It's kind of
so
fun.
It makes Woolf so hard.
Yeah. I find it interesting. Yeah, it was a fun book to read. When I'm looking at them, one of the things that Bradshaw says is Bradshaw has this infallible instinct, this proportion, and this is the thing that he deems how the world works. And we go into his mindset, and it's very mechanical, and it's this clock-like mentality. It's very organized. He's like, this equals this, therefore this must happen. Women do this, I do this. When my wife was mentally ill, she did this. She had one moment out of turn. She left, did one thing that was a mistake. And then from there, suddenly she's mentally ill. I gave her rest. She got better.
Yeah.
And then there's this point when that narrator comes in. And then the narrator says, but proportion has a sister. And this is the part where I was like, see, Virginia's having a conversation about modernism.
I want to look up this passage.
Yeah, proportion has a sister. It's on page 146 through 149. I have the whole book.
Okay.
Has a sister, and the sister is conversion. And obviously, when you have proportions, that's when you start to mess with proportions. When you have these conversions fluctuate. They mess around. It's a very particular term. It can do statistical and scientific, but it's also something where she talks about this analysis of what's going on, like, in someone's headspace. How does that proportionality of what's going on externally, that I guess makes sense, how does it get converted into one's mind? How does that conversion start to mess with the human nature or what's going on in one's mind space? I think that kind of plays into what's going on with mental illness and mental health in some sense.
Proportion has a sister. I love that. Conversion, I think, speaks to the novel's emphasis on intersubjectivity. How the subjectivities, there are many subjectivities that enmesh with one another. No individual feels isolated in this novel. They kind of blend into one another. Clarissa Dalloway's interior is so shaped by her interactions with others. It's almost like, who is Clarissa? It's a shorthand for this network of selves that meet in London, right? I love the idea of conversion as being a metaphor for intersubjectivity. And I think, too, that to bring this back to mental illness, mental illness requires a sense of normative psychology, that there is a normal way to function cognitively, and that brings you into contact with the social. It's not, you can't keep it in the realm of the interior anymore, right? It never was just in the realm of the interior. No measure of one's psychology is only interior. It's always in relation to a social norm, right? So I think if modernism does one thing, if Woolf does one thing, I think it's to get us to interrogate our social norms.
Yeah, I think about the social norms a lot in this book as well. If just for a quick second, I want to talk about, as it's my own vendetta, in terms of Clarissa's relationship, in terms of her sexuality, seems to play a lot into that understanding of what is normal and what is, because a lot of her friends, especially like Peter, deem her as this normal woman who likes to do things like throw parties and be just so specific towards people, give people gifts and give them little notes and send things that he deems very stereotypical feminine things, very normal things. And one of the most, I think, unnormal things about her is that she has a relationship with a woman when she's young, right there in the same house that this Peter Dalloway, who is obsessed with. She has this relationship with men. She has these interests of this thing going on with a woman when she was younger, and she seems to see this as a very bizarre aspect of love, because she's like, I loved her the way a man loves a woman.
Right.
And I'd also think about, in terms of mental illness, especially during this time period, this would be deemed as mentally ill as well.
And that you could cure
yeah.
Homosexuality, right?
Yeah.
That it was something, it's a deviance from the norm that could be addressed, fixed.
Yeah.
It needs to be cured. Yeah.
If it was seen. And
right.
I think that's the biggest aspect.
Yeah.
Was it ever seen, or was it ever brought out that she was in that relationship? Not really.
Mm-hmm.
Her past fling gets married later in the novel to a rich man. There never really seems to be that much of a conversation about it, that much outside of her own mental dwellings about it. When I'm reading someone who deems themselves as completely sane, which I'm 100% convinced he's not, Mr. Welsh, it's like this relativity of like everything's connected. They're talking about their external state versus their internal, who's mentally ill, who's not mentally ill. I think all of them have some element that would make them seem out of the norm, or not well.
Well, just like, imagine your image of a sane person. That's not, to me, that's not a mentally well person.
Yeah, and that's the
right?
thing. Right? Every single one of them have this own mentality of what would be a mentally well person, it seems like. For her, she's like, I wouldn't be dwelling on this. I wouldn't be so focused on, I'm old. That's not, she almost deems it as like this moral failure that she's getting older. And
I mean, God, that
yeah.
I think especially women often do face aging as a moral failure,
and
which
like
is absurd.
Like, it's a health failure to get old.
Right.
Like, why is that? It's such an incessant feeling in this novel. Every single time they talk about how well, she's talking about life, she's talking about health. That's what her party is for. And then the first thing Welsh starts talking about after he kisses her hands is like, she's gotten old, but I won't tell her that. I won't tell her that she's gotten older. As if the period of you leaving to go to India, getting married, and then coming back, you guys are age 53, and she's 50. Was she not supposed to age?
You know, that I never thought about the relationships between aging and the clock in this novel so much, but I think that's something interesting for me to look for next time I read it, which is the most sane thing would be to adhere to mechanical clock time, which would lead you to say, of course, individuals age. Like, as the clock moves, the skin sags, memory fades,
But then that's also like an element of human nature, though.
Right.
And
but so the second point, I think, which is where you're going, is it's completely unreasonable to expect someone not to age.
Yeah.
The expectation that youth could be held on to for good is an absurdity. It's like raging against the clock, So there's a contradiction there in claiming to be rational while also regretting that someone ages. Of course we age. Like, the alternative is you die.
Of course, the clock is
as the clock chimes.
going as we talk about. I feel like, in some essence, this book has this conversation of the way modernism does as a whole. Modernism has this kind of friction between nature versus the mechanics. This empirical, scientific, A plus B equals C kind of mentality that a lot of modernists really like to delve into. But this novel talks about how everything's connected. It talks about nature a lot. It like compares a lot of women to birds, and it like has this very natural element to it. And it almost seems like the most unnatural thing that starts to occur is not only the clock, but also these strict social norms, these things that are deemed as the law, basically, are the things that affect all the characters the most. in a messed up way. While you are going through a mental crisis, like Septimus would your first response be to go, I'm depressed? He didn't have a word for it. He just said he was feeling nothing.
Right.
And his response is, I'll marry a woman.
Mm-hmm.
That wouldn't be my first response if I was that. But to be fair, I'm also dwelling on the end where, like, a lot of psychotherapy, all these they've been fleshed out a lot more at the point I'm at.
Right.
So when I look at reading these characters, I'm reading them all as they're all going through things. They're, as I think Woolf likes to say, I think this novel is very much ahead of its time in that mentality because of that. I don't think a single character in the traditional sense of the health, of the empirical health, is actually healthy in this book.
Right. Woolf is extremely sensitive to the torments of the inner life.
Yeah.
As a human problem. Woolf herself dealt with mental illness, especially at the end of her life. She committed suicide. But she, in her fiction, she is really great with character for that reason. She's sympathetic in a way to all of her characters, even the bad ones. I wanted to, what you were saying about birds and nature and all that, I was thinking about, like, the presence of the clock, the Big Ben, the buses, the cityscape of Mrs. Dalloway. There's a tension in the novel, I think, between the natural and the subjective and the human and the mechanical and the technological. And this is just a thought. So this novel's almost 100 years old now. Is it dated in that way? Like, I almost feel like there's almost no space outside of the mechanical anymore. It's like it's turned to the digital, which is like more pervasive than the mechanical.
It's even scarier.
Yeah.
I don't have to turn my clock back anymore and hear the gears turning anymore.
Right. Like Big Ben or the iPhone. Like the iPhone's
the
on
iPhone
my
is
head.
terrifying.
Yeah.
My goodness. Yeah.
Big Ben is ubiquitous in that it can be seen and heard from many places in London, but it's not intimate. The intimacy of the digital seems like we're in a different time.
It's so personal.
Yeah. It's personal. Like that is, see, like this novel I think affords a gap, a tension between the personal and the technological. What you just said is like they're the same thing.
Digital is, I think, is personal.
Yeah.
In a way that interrogates people constantly with the mechanization, that friction perpetually.
And this thing's effect on mental wellness.
Yes.
That guy's like, that's another way of thinking about this novel with today. Like the space apart from the mechanical seems like a necessary respite for one's wellness. It's almost like we're not afforded that space anymore.
It's almost impossible now. I think about now, to go back to that, understanding what's going on now. We're post-pandemic. We're post, we have a lot of wars going on. So we're not 100, I think we're always in a perpetual state. I've not lived a single moment in my life without a war. So I do not know if I could ever say I'll be in a post-war period.
That actually connects our moment very much to 100 years ago.
Exactly. I look at this book and I look at modernism. They have this sense of, they can feel the gap. And I feel like the gap isn't really there anymore as much. And I think because of that, that's why we could feel it so much during COVID. You can hear your friends on the phone. You can see them digitally, but you know you're not physically there. And it gives this weird sense of tension because it's like almost as close as this. Like you can see them, you can hear them, but they're not there. It's like a ghost. It's kind of creepy and it's depressing. And I think when I'm looking at this book, I look back on him talking about Evans and how he's like muttering, he sees this dead man, he's freaking out. And I don't know, it just seems like when we look at things now and we look at mental health, you can just look at it like this. Like now you can just search it up. You can just hear people talking about your mental state, like from the internal, from the external. Before, some people even had those synapses to fire yet to go, maybe that's not okay. That moment when he had to seek out his illness. Sometimes your phone will like be like, I already figured it out for you. That's scary.
Yeah.
I've had many moments where some of my friends said they're struggling with something and they were in a process of analyzation in some form in terms of illness. They could search it up on their phone, or they could see a conversation on TikTok about it before they even had the connection that maybe that was what was going on with them. It's terrifying.
That seems like it interferes with introspection.
Interfering with introspection.
Yeah.
Which is like a big aspect of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you've got to... It's an interesting connection to Dalloway too. Like the intersubjectivity is maybe a way of saying that the self as a whole is compromised through this network of relations to others. It seems like, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems like the field of psychology probably would say having an integrated sense of self is good for one's overall well-being, right?
Yeah. Well, I feel like we opened a can of worms from two people who are not psychologists.
Yeah. Could somebody diagnose us for this conversation?
Oh.
Yeah.
Please don't. I find this book really good. I am so happy we could have this conversation. Especially with everything going on. I think mental health is in the minds of so many people. And when you read a book where it's in your face, even before, mental health was such an open conversation, I sometimes I read books like this, I'm like, it was always there.
Yeah.
It was always there. The way we talk about things now, I don't know. I really enjoyed this conversation.
That is always the case.
Yes.
It was always there. That's a good slogan to keep in mind. If you feel alone, isolated, as if you're facing something that no one else ever has, that's a good pitch for reading. Yeah. Because reading enough will introduce you to the fact that historically and spatially right now, you're not alone.
Yeah, you're not alone.
Yeah.
Mental health has always been mental health and caring about your well-being. Mental illness has always been a thing. It's always been there. And this modernist writer, Virginia Woolf, let me tell you, she started talking about it very early. Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone who's watching us. I'll reach back to you in the conclusion.
Thank you.
Bye.